extremely grateful for you all for coming out on a beautiful May day, and also in particular to Grace, who just picked her up in the airport about an hour ago. Straight down, got a quick coffee and Anam, straight in here for a yarn. So we're very grateful for her for being here. We have some programs, and there's a QR code on the table as well on your share. So Jan sent a scanner, Liberdal, Tamatagiri Ashka, we want your feedback on the events. We're trying to improve the festival every year, so give us your thoughts. Probably wait until the end before you give us your thoughts, to be too early. And then we'll try and bring that on board for next year. There's also a couple of other events at 6 o'clock the night, and there's pre-primary school, John Paul II, just up the street here. There's a film being shown, Our Women. It's scanning almost Ra First, a film honouring the women of Belfast, and that's being shown at 6 o'clock tomorrow or tonight. And then tomorrow as well, there's a very dodgy suspect tour of the Black Mountain by somebody who's probably going to make up half the history of the Black Mountain on the spot. So that's happening at 12:30 up in Newhill, and again, you're all welcome. We're going to try and do that bilingually, da hangak, and so you learn a wee bit of Irish as well while you're on the mountain, so to falter over if it's in. Madger listen Laganamak and Shaw. Grace is going to speak for about half an hour. Then I'm probably going to use Mrs. Easton's chair and ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open up the floor. So keep them burning. More questions than comments, if preferable. As somebody says, if we wanted your long-winded comment, we would have got you up to speak. Okay, so we're asking you the questions. So we were introduced to Grace through a mutual friend, Joe Gainan, from the Democracy Collaborative. Joe's been a big friend of ours for the past number of years. He actually spoke at this festival, I believe, a couple of years ago as part of that, and he introduced us to Grace. And then Grace asked for a chat because she's researching a new book that she's probably going to talk about as part of her speech. And myself and Fergal went with her on Zoom. And within 2 minutes of meeting, we said, you have to come over and give her a talk for us, which she kindly agreed to do so. So fair play to her for doing that. Grace done the degree of Empire at the University of Empire. And if you think I'm just insulting this girl, that's her words. She told me that on the way down in the car. She studied history, philosophy, and economics at Oxford University. She's obviously a well-renowned writer. She's an anti-capitalist activist, a staff writer at the Tribune Magazine, and the author of several books, including Vulture Capitalism, which Kieran O'Brien has here in his mitt. I know he's looking to get it signed later. Backdoor Bailouts and the Death of Freedom, as well as the Corona Crisis, How the Pandemic Will Change Capitalism, and Stolen, How to Save the World from Financialisation. She's a former economics commentator for the New Statesman, a former research fellow at the Institute of Public Policy Research, and she appears frequently in international media, which is how my man knows her. She went, Grace Blakeley's coming over. I can't wait to go. Brilliant. So, Gurm Wagif is checked the cards of Kirgy, far in a falsa, Rev Grace, August Margaret, maybe Jason, and Kesna, Kirgy, and Jerry. Gurm Wagif.
Thank you. I'm actually going to stand up if that's okay. So, can I? Wait. Oh. There we go. I don't like having to sit in one place. I like, to be able to gesture. So, I hope that's okay. Right, thanks so much for having me today, guys. It's great to be here, and it's amazing to hear about what you guys are doing. Like, genuinely so cool, so exciting. And yeah, I wanted to chat to you guys because what you're doing here very much links with what I've been researching and writing about over the last few years. So I wrote Vulture Capitalism, I guess it must have been like 3 years ago that it came out. And it was basically about how we don't live in a free market capitalist system, that global capitalism is actually highly concentrated, highly centralized. The old critique of kind of communism and socialism was that it was this form of kind of centralized political and economic power that undermined freedom. And I was like, well, that's just how capitalism works today, right? We do not live under the kind of total power of one centralized state, but we do exist under the power of this kind of nexus of corporate, financial, political interests that really work together to kind of preserve the status quo. We have these huge, powerful monopolies that dominate the global economy. We have states that are in the pockets of the billionaires who run these corporations. The financial institutions are, supporting, these big businesses. And we have this form of kind of what I called capitalist planning, essentially. That I think is an argument that is broadly true and has only become more true in recent years as we've seen corporate power grow, particularly in and around tech. But the thing that I kind of came away from the book tour with, the thought that I had whilst speaking about all these things, was that how to create the space for resistance in a world with that level of kind of concentrated and centralized political power. And I did some research for Vulture Capitalism where I was looking at, okay, so if capitalism is this system of kind of centralized political, economic, social power, then how can we fight back against that? And the answer for me was, if capitalism is the same as kind of centralization, then resistance to capitalism is really the same as democracy. And I drew on this kind of Marxist tradition that's kind of been, a bit overlooked or forgotten, which actually says if you want to build a movement that's capable of resisting this system, it has to come from the ground up. It has to be this real invigoration of democracy that gives people power over their own lives. But there was always a bit of a gap there, because as I went around talking about these ideas about, concentration, centralization of power, imperialism, all of these kind of big concepts, I would often speak in a room like this, and people, particularly young people, would kind of stick their hand up and be like, yeah, I agree. That's basically the common sense view of the world that we all have. I spent 3 years researching this book, doing all this in-depth research, citing all of these political theorists, and then these 18-year-olds are like, yeah, well, obviously. What can we do about it? And that was what led me to writing the next book, was that question of what can we do? It was actually more frequently phrased as, what can I do, right? Everyone wanted the answer to that question, what can I do? If I'm talking about the big tech companies and how they're screwing us over, okay, well, can we quit that one and start using that technology instead? Or if I'm talking about climate breakdown, it's okay, well, can we change our habits to, make our lives more sustainable? Or if I'm talking about, any evil corporation that's done any evil thing, and there's a lot of really great examples of that in Vulture Capitalism. Okay, great, we boycott that corporation and use a different corporation, and we start voting for another political party. And everyone wanted to answer this question of what can I do in these really individualistic terms, right? And for me, the tradition that I was writing from, this Marxist socialist tradition, that's such an alien way of looking at politics. You don't come at these questions by saying, what can I do? Because as an individual, you can't do anything, right? As an individual, you are going up against these huge, powerful vested interests. And that's what made me realize, okay, well, this is one of the biggest problems in politics today, is that because we have this view of the world, which is we are all isolated individuals competing with each other to survive, we feel completely powerless, right? Because we see ourselves as, what can I do? The only way I could respond to this system is by changing the things I buy or changing the political party that I vote for. We don't have this sense of collective power that has historically been the root of left politics and indeed all forms of progressive politics. So, people come away from this, what was called a kind of common sense analysis of capitalism, not with a sense of outrage that can be mobilized for change, but with a profound sense of powerlessness. And as I kind of researched this book, I realized that this sense of powerlessness was really, really widespread. I think that a big part of the story of the rise of the far right is not just about economic disenfranchisement and the fact that, people have been fucked over since the financial crisis and we haven't had a decade of wage stagnation and now we have a cost of living crisis. All of that stuff is there, but it's not just that. Because historically, if your boss wasn't giving you a wage that was increasing in line with inflation, you would have organized with your co-workers and said, hey guys, I can't afford to make ends meet, what about you? They would have been like, yeah, we're also struggling. Right, okay, let's get together and come up with a collective solution as to how we fight back against this system. You would have organized in your workplace and ultimately, brought that fight to your boss and said, we deserve a wage in line with inflation, you have to give us a pay rise. But today that isn't on anyone's minds whatsoever. Those 18-year-olds that stand up and say, okay, what can I do about it? If I'm join a union, half of them are like, what's a union, right? And they're in workplaces where it is it's very difficult to unionize a lot of the time. So that idea of collective power and collective solidarity has been stripped out of our consciousness in a very, very deliberate way. And there was a story I kind of wanted to tell you because I think it links up this question of of powerlessness with some of the political changes that we're seeing in England, and I'm sure it will resonate here as well. Because some of you may know, I was pretty involved with the Labour Party when Jeremy Corbyn was leader. And I did a lot of campaigning all over the country. And I remember going to a bunch of places that would have been caricatured by the likes of Boris Johnson as a kind of left behind area, right? Somewhere that hadn't seen very much economic growth, that had been left out of the kind of financialized economic model that the UK has pursued for really since the 1980s. And, you know, going to those places and speaking to those people, I would kind of go around and knock on the door and say, hello, you know, do you know how you're going to be voting at the next election? And most of the time they'd say, oh no, I'm not really into politics very much. And I'd say, well, have you considered voting for the Labour Party? And kind of list some of the policies that we were advocating at the time. And expecting, you know, these ideas around increasing wages, increasing investment, supporting working people, boosting public services, taxing the rich, all of these things I would expect would be places that would be policies that would resonate in an area that has been so screwed over by this kind of centralized, financialized political model for so long. And the thing that I would always get in response was, okay, well, how are you going to pay for all that, right? And then I would like list the policies in the manifesto. Well, we've done the sums and this is how we're going to pay for it. And then the guy, I remember, that there was one particular example of this conversation. It was in a former mining town. And the guy at the doorstep just responded, okay, well, that's all very well, but like, I've heard this same spiel from politicians at my doorstep and activists at my doorstep over and over again. I voted Labour my whole life. They've been in power locally my whole life, and nothing has ever changed. You know, how am I supposed to trust that this is any different? And I had nothing to say in response to that. You know, me as like a young activist, how am I going to convince this guy that voting for this political party is going to change anything? I think there is that real sense that politicians are all the same. You know, we see this all the time. Politicians are all the same. Voting isn't going to change anything. And it's kind of legitimate. It's kind of justified. That anger, that rage against the status quo, and that sense of powerlessness that comes out of it is a completely legitimate response to living in a capitalist system in which power is incredibly centralized and in which you confront that system as this isolated individual, as someone who doesn't feel part of these forms of collective power that usually would have formed the core of the resistance to this model. And I think, you know, you guys will probably recognize that kind of interaction because I think it's taking place all over the world. I think that, you know, we all experience this sense of isolation, atomization, and powerlessness in the face of global forces, global trends that we want to resist, but don't really know how. And I think there are a couple of different ways of responding. You know, the more I've thought about this, the more I've thought, okay, there are a few different ways to respond to this sense of powerlessness. One of which is despair, which I think I see a lot on the left nowadays, actually. It's like, okay, well, we know the answers, but there's nothing we can really do about it. You know, people are going to continue to vote against their own interests. You know, even if we wanted to, even if we took power electorally, there wouldn't be anything that we can do. I think that kind of response of despair is often quite common on the left now. And then there's the response of rage, which is like, I feel completely screwed over by this system. I feel powerless. And anger lets me feel like I have power again. If I can like really make myself feel strong, get myself angry, then it feels like I have this power and influence that I'm able to wield within this system. And I think that's basically what is driving the rise of the far right today, because historically, if you look back to the origins of the rise of fascism in Italy, the word fascism comes from the term fasces, which was a Roman weapon, and it was a bunch of individual sticks tied together with an axe in the middle. And the symbolism of this weapon was one stick you can break pretty easily, but a bundle of sticks tied together you can't break. And actually, you can turn into a kind of powerful tool to beat your enemies. And this symbolism was actually drawn from the symbolism of the trade union movement, which is one finger is quite easy to break, but a raised fist is much harder to break, that together we are strong. And fascists have, ever since the origin of fascism, been using that same argument of alone, you might not be strong and powerful enough. You feel powerless in this system where power is so concentrated, where you're not in control of most of the decisions that affect your life, where you want things to change. But no matter what you do, everything seems to just stay the same. And the fascist answer is, we will make you feel strong again. And especially in the context of a labour movement that's really just been torn to pieces since the 1980s, that imagery is really strong. That sense of, if we work together, we can not only feel strong and powerful again and no one can break us, but we can fight back against, and the fascist answer is, people who are weaker than us. And that will make us feel strong, and this system that makes us feel powerless, having that sense of agency back is what's going to make us feel, human again, really. Traditionally, of course, that kind of sense of agency and power would have been something that you could have gained through organizing in the labor movement, through saying, okay, this powerful person, this powerful institution is trying to screw me over. They're trying to reduce my wages. They're not giving me a pay rise. They're trying to make me work longer than they should. But I'm not going to let them, because I'm going to organize with the people around me to take that fight to those at the top. And that form of collective power that has been decimated and that the fascists have attempted to kind of emulate, it was obviously very intentionally destroyed. And it was destroyed, this is a big part of what I've been looking at in the book, the neoliberal language and the neoliberal attempt to really take aim at all of the sources of collective power that have existed historically in capitalist societies, and not just crush them using the force of the state. Yes, crush them using the force of the state, but also replace that sense of solidarity that came naturally to so many people in so many places throughout so much of our history with this hyper-individualized competitive mindset. And Thatcher famously said in the 1980s, obviously there's no such thing as society, right? That wasn't just an observation, that was a statement of intent. But more than that, she said, the method is economics, the object is to change the soul. And by spreading this marketized view of society in which you do see yourself as one individual fighting with other individuals to get to the top, you have your own private pension pot, and it's your job as a good consumer and investor, as a good mini capitalist, to build up your savings and put it into your pot so you can protect yourself. Social insurance, nah, we don't want that. We want individualized forms of insurance. It's the same thing with the privatization of housing, right? You can become a nice, good little mini capitalist. You can build up your pot of capital in your home and protect yourself from the rest of the world. And in doing so, kind of basically win this big, broad market game that the neoliberals were so keen to kind of project on the rest of us. And they did it really successfully. If you look at just the language of politics and of society, you can see the changing terminology that politicians use to describe people. Instead of workers, we become entrepreneurs, right? So we're not workers who can identify with other workers against bosses. We're all thinking of ourselves as mini entrepreneurs in the gig economy. We're, working to compete against other little mini entrepreneurs to get to the top. Instead of citizens who have a stake in our government, we become consumers of public services. This was a big part of the kind of new Labour push to marketize our public services, to see citizens as just consumers. And communities, instead of these groups of people who are rooted in place and rooted in their relationships with one another, become just households. That's how governments talk about people now. It's just households, right? There's really no space for the idea of community in this neoliberal vision in which you are on your own. You don't collaborate. And there was an obvious reason for this, which is that when people do collaborate, as governments that preceded Thatcher and as Thatcher herself saw, when people do collaborate and when people do have this sense of collective power and consciousness and solidarity, they are powerful. they can not just disrupt these systems that have been created to crush us, they can actually start to build new things. There's a French sociologist who I quote a lot in the book, who wrote this book, The Ungovernable Society, right? And the neoliberals told us when they were introducing their free market reforms that all of that cutting taxes, cutting public services, deregulation, that this was all about freedom, that it was about building a free market and allowing us all to, generate prosperity and build our businesses and build our little pots of capital. That was the kind of mythology. But what I show in the book, in Vulture Capitalism, was obviously that neoliberalism never had anything to do with freedom. In fact, it made us less free in lots of different ways. We end up being controlled by our bosses. We have political institutions that are corrupted and, no longer have that kind of democratic power that we once had. Instead, what this French sociologist argues is that neoliberalism was a response to the perceived ungovernability of society. He wrote this book called The Ungovernable Society, and he quotes all of these neoliberal theorists basically saying people are too well organized. They understand their rights, they understand their power far too much, whether that was people organizing in the labor movement, whether it was people organizing in the peace movement, organizing in local government all across the country. There were all of these really powerful movements that were rooted in this sense of collective power, of people coming together to challenge the system, challenge those at the top. And neoliberalism was just an attempt to destroy that. It was an attempt to divide people amongst themselves so that they could be more easily dominated and controlled, so that they could be more easily exploited by bosses, so that they could be more easily controlled by politicians as well. And it was astonishingly successful. Yes, because they used the power of the state to, crush communities like this, to crush the labor movement, to destroy all of the bastions of socialist power in local government, but also because they spread this ideology that says you shouldn't compete. Competition, we see this echoes of this in the kind of manosphere movement today, right? Collaboration is weakness. We should be competing, we should be hustling, we should be pushing each other out of the way to get to the top. That is so strange that we now see that kind of competitive mindset as strength, because it has been pushed upon us to make people weaker with respect to capital and with respect to the state. And today, I think this problem of powerlessness, it comes back to the fact that we are so busy competing with one another, and I think probably here is an exception, but generally speaking, most people are so busy competing with each other that we've forgotten what it's like to work together to change things. We've forgotten those forms of collective power that would have allowed us to genuinely take back control. That line that the Brexit movement used in the UK, take back control, it had so much resonance because people feel like they don't have any control. They feel like they don't have any power because they live in these centralized systems and they confront those systems as isolated individuals. So, how can we fight back? This is really why I'm here. It's why I wanted to talk to you guys, because I think the roots of that movement to regain that sense of solidarity lie in experiments in building genuine democracy from the bottom up, experiments in building genuine solidarity and genuine community. Both because those are important places where we can kind of come together and protect each other from the kind of ravages of a capitalist economy. But more than that, because we're trying to fight back against this Thatcherite quote of the method is economics, the object is to change the soul, right? We need to break the stranglehold of this competitive individualist mindset that has over our entire society. Because as long as we are confronting this system as isolated, atomized individuals trying to change what I can do, right? Even if you're the most radical left-wing person in the world and you want to vote for the Communist Party or whoever and nationalization and whatever, if you are only seeing your politics in terms of something that you as an individual are doing, even if that's going out to vote, if that's, changing the way that you're buying things or engaging with the capitalist economy, for as long as you are seeing that as something that you are doing as one person, there's not going to be any change. It's not radical. It's the illusion of radicalism without the substance that makes those at the top genuinely scared. So, I think this has real implications for the way that we think about politics and the way that we think about the links between all the different types of politics that takes place within our society, right? Because if you say politics, people are going to think, okay, elections. When I say politics, I think places where people are building power. And that means something much bigger and much broader than just organizing around elections. That is really important. And, it's something that I still do and still talk about all the time. But I remember when Zach Belansky was elected as leader of the Green Party, and I voted for him, and I was very excited about it because I was very pissed off at Keir Starmer. And I wrote a piece immediately after that, which came off the back of the lessons that I'd learned from organising in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. And it was entitled, "Nobody's Coming to Save Us." And I thought this was a really important intervention to make because there was obviously the Greens were emerging, there was your party that was coming up. And I was like, look guys, I'm as excited about this as the rest of you. It's great that we have a new political movement that's existing outside of the two main political parties that have dominated for so long and which have just screwed us over at the same time as we have this insurgent threat from reform. Fantastic. But if I learned anything from 2017 and 2019 and everything that's happened since then, it's that we cannot rely on any one individual to come and save us and to come and change things for all of us. There's so many limitations to that model. Firstly, those people are going to be taken down to the best extent of all of the vested interests that exist within the media, the state, big business, whatever. But it's more than that, because for as long as we are maintaining this view of, thank God someone's come and they're going to fix everything, nothing's going to change. And I get that, because I feel the same way. I'm like, oh my God, thank God there's a politician finally who's saying things that I agree with. Great. But it's not enough. Because yes, that person is vulnerable and could be taken down, but also we cannot transform the kind of society that we live in if we're still adopting that one-to-one, that individualistic mindset. So for me, this long-term project of building socialism, and that is my long-term project, is I think very much linked with rebuilding democracy. And that project of rebuilding democracy is just so... it's inseparable from the project of building community and building collective power. That's really why I wanted to talk to you guys. That's why I was really interested in the work that Gael-Ionad was doing, because you really are, from the limited amount that I've heard and seen, combating that sense of isolation that results in so many, not just like broad social problems, but individual mental health problems that results in, these feelings of despair and loneliness and isolation. That all comes from this mindset of you're on your own, nobody's going to have your back if you fall. That's the kind of bedrock of capitalist ideology. And you guys are proving, and all of the other projects that I'm interviewing, and there are loads of them all over the world. It's really exciting. I know you guys had Kali Akuno here last year, who's doing a similar sort of thing in the US. They really just show the extraordinary power of just giving people places and spaces and projects to connect around, to build power, to build community, to build solidarity around. It is a really radicalizing project, much more even than forcing people to come and sit around and listen to a lecture about Marxism, as much as I would love to be able to do that all the time. Giving people a sense of their power to change things in their place is such a radical thing, because those at the top really do want us to believe that we don't have any power, that all we can do is, buy a different product because we're worried about the environment, or vote for a different political party, which is just the same version of the other political party that's been in power for 4 years because we can't get access to public services, that we can just find another job if we're worried about our wage. All of these individualized solutions are just, they function to maintain the system as it is. And it's when we come together in our places, in our workplaces, in our communities, on the streets, in our political movements, and we change things. That's how consciousness is built. We were saying in the car, right, that class consciousness, political consciousness doesn't come from randomly learning ideas. It comes from recognizing the power that you have, that we all have, when we come together and build alternatives. And I love seeing it. It's really hopeful, it's really exciting, it's really optimistic. And funnily enough, coming out of writing Vulture Capitalism, I think I was like, you know what, I'm really proud of this argument, I'm glad I made this argument, but I don't feel that hopeful about the future. But the last few years that I've spent speaking to people who are doing work in their communities, unionists who are organizing in Google, at TikTok to take on the big tech companies, amazing kind of cooperative movement that's sprung up all over the world to protect people from the ravages of neoliberalism at the same time as building political movements as well. All of these, what you might think of as kind of small things, they've given me so much more hope than this kind of broad analysis of capitalism. And I do think that is what is going to, it's the beginnings of what I see as the big transformation that is going to take root in our societies over the next several decades, because we are going down this route of just like unparalleled levels of centralized political power. When we're thinking about the control that like the big tech companies have over our lives through AI, financial institutions have over our places in our governments, states that are increasingly just, to think they can just go and start a war halfway around the world whilst we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis and no one's going to notice. This power is just being taken further and further and further out of our hands. And the thing that makes me so excited and so happy even in that context is that in that gap where democratic accountability used to exist, institutions like this are rising up and taking that place. And that gives me a lot of hope for the future. So thanks very much, guys. I'll stop there and take questions.
Thank you, Chris. That was really good. I wonder if you could unpack a wee bit some of the limitations of party politics and how that has become the essential mode of organising for people on the left and on the right. So unpack a wee bit the limitations of that, but also if you could maybe with some references of some of the lessons you've learned around actually unpacking for people what actual political organising is and what it isn't. We've got a long history of conflict here and a long understanding of politics beyond just electoral politics, but we have come through a period of unlearning some of the lessons that we have previously learned in terms of the limitations of electoral politics. In this community, for example, the majority of people supported their vote for a long time, and then we had like an avenue, I suppose, in terms of electoral politics, but more and more people from a socialist background or a radical Republican background are actually in the limitations of electoral politics, but are looking around for somewhere to go, and somewhere to do, and some work to do, and they can't see it because maybe the work that they see, for example, in the morning maybe doesn't seem important or grandiose enough. But maybe we can just unpack some of that stuff for me.
Yeah, I think, the reason that we've been left with this like hollowed out version of democracy where voting once every 4 years is seen as really the kind of only form of political engagement you can do. It was a very kind of active strategy that was pursued by neoliberal free market reformers who had this kind of strange relationship with democracy, because on the one hand they were like, we kind of need democracy, it plays into these ideas we have around freedom, it allows us to kind of influence what's going on in politics when we organize to get different business interests to influence what goes on within the state. So we kind of broadly want to keep democracy, but we have this problem, which is that the masses, there's too many of them, and if they're able to all vote in the same way, then they're going to take control of the economic institutions that we want to control, and do things like shift taxation and regulation in such a way that kind of disfavors capital. So their very kind of concrete and coherent plan was to say, leave democracy in its kind of hollowed out form, but crush all of the institutions that allowed people to engage in democratic institutions as citizens. So crush the labour movement, right? If you think of like engagement with democracy as a kind of a terrain of battle almost, then historically you would have business interests organised into think tanks and lobbying organisations and whatever. And within state institutions, they would meet the power of organised labour and they would fight and disagree. And then the state would kind of mediate. That was what social democracy was based on, basically. It was this like mediation between labour and capital in government. So when you crush the labour movement, all you're left with is think tanks, lobbyists, communications agencies, just basically going in and kind of influencing the government and saying, do this, do that. And there's very little resistance from anywhere. So crushing the labour movement was a really important part of that. Crushing local government was, again, a really central part of the neoliberal movement. Thatcher came for the GLC. She came for councils that were perceived as kind of socialist all over the country and massively centralised political power in Westminster. That was another core part of the neoliberal movement. It was centralisation, take power away from communities. There was obviously a broad fight against any form of protest and civil society organising, a fight that this Labour government has very actively continued by doing things like banning Palestine Action. You know, that's not just a kind of reactive thing. That is a core part of this project, to actively disorganise the rest of society and tell them the only way that you can kind of change things is by voting for this selection of political parties that we will allow you to vote for, and the rest of them are kind of worthless anyway. So reversing all that requires us to build power in all of these different places at the same time, which is really hard, right? You know, we kind of, and also we haven't even had the route to be able to engage in politics because the political parties have all been taken over by vested interests and the membership sidelined and all of that sort of stuff. So, you know, on all of these fronts, we're having to build power simultaneously. And I think there is actually a role for political parties in supporting this ecosystem. If you have a good political party, then yeah. I've done a lot of work in Belgium where they have the PTB, which is the Workers' Party, the old Communist Party, who had a bit of a kind of revival and basically realised if we're going to be relevant, we need to get rooted in our communities. And so they act as a kind of umbrella organization almost of like doing political education. They had like a medical group of workers who would go in and like provide healthcare in communities. They had like, political education societies like were supporting communities to do things like prevent the government from shutting down their local swimming pools and all that sort of stuff. So they became this kind of node in a broader ecology of organizations that was about building power within the community. And obviously they have historic links with the trade union movement as well. So I do think like political parties are an important part of that balance, but we also need to be thinking, okay, are you in a workplace that has a union? Can you join that union and can you make it more radical? If not, can you form a union? This has been some fascinating work I've been seeing recently about how young workers literally being like, we're going to start a union, completely outside of the old textbook playbook as to how you're supposed to start a union. Starbucks workers in the US, for example, just literally being like, I heard about unions on TikTok, let's make one, right? This kind of like new form of experimentation in labor movement organizing is also really important. What you guys are doing in the community, like if you have that community, not like the infrastructure, but just the social networks that make sure you're able to have that level of trust in your community, building the infrastructure on top of that, like this, is, again, such a critical part of any form of political organizing and consciousness raising. And then there's, you know, the kind of broader social movement organizing, like the movement for peace against the genocide in Gaza, the environmental movement. Like all of these movements are ways of bringing people together in solidarity to fight for something. And it's kind of, you know, it's such a one-sided battlefield because we have to be building along all of these different fronts at the same time. But what is exciting is that we are, and they reinforce each other. I've lost count of the number of conversations I've had with people who literally go on a march for Palestine and then they meet someone and suddenly they're engaged in something in their community. I met this amazing person who'd been on a Palestine march and was like, I want to do something in my community, which was Bristol. So she set up the Bristol apartheid-free zone, went around knocking on all these shopkeepers' doors and said, will you commit to not stocking any produce from Israel? And she started this movement that then grew up in her own community just on the back of going to this one protest. So there's so many ways of thinking about what politics and what organising looks like, and I actually think that they can reinforce each other rather than kind of taking away from each other.
What's that? Kieran?
Again, thank you, Chris, for the speech. I wanted to ask, because you referenced the previous book a few times, the one before that, we've went to your COVID. I mean, I think when we think back, it was only 6 years ago, but it does feel like a lifetime ago, that once the pandemic hit and the lockdown started, the mutual aid that grew up in communities all over the world. I mean, most of us here will know about how our communities reacted to it in terms of people going and helping each other and so on. And a lot of people thinking about maybe there is a different way to organise society and the economy and so on, and starting to realise who the essential workers and all were and so on. But I think there was a quick reaction to that in terms of let's shut that down, let's get back to the status quo, and as I say, it was only a few years ago, it feels like a lifetime for a lot of us. I'm curious, I mean, with your work going around communities and seeing, obviously where people are trying to build power, in different ways, do you think there's maybe still a legacy of what came out of that there? I mean, because I think when that disruption happened, I mean, the amount of people who did come out and help each other and did things in different ways, I mean, gave for at least if it even was for 1 second, gave so many people a glimpse of if there is an alternative here. I mean, another word is possible as you wrote for me. But just to me, so I'm just wondering if you see maybe a bit of a legacy around how people did react at that time. Is there something maybe still there, or was it snuffed out? But hopefully, of course, it wasn't.
Yeah, no, I think there were kind of two trajectories that you saw during lockdown, right? One of which was that tendency towards mutual aid that you described, people being like, we're facing this collective threat, we all need to work together, I need to go and protect, help the person who can't go out and do their shopping and bring that for them, I need to, volunteer for the NHS, all that sort of stuff. And there was this kind of countervailing tendency of people being shut down in their own homes and not really able to communicate and talk to people, right? And this kind of hopeful, optimistic tendency was awesome. It obviously arose out of a very particular moment, which was a moment that we had control over our time, right? A lot of people were furloughed, so they were being paid and they could go and decide what they wanted to do with their lives. Other people were working from home, but not really working from home, right? We had so much more control over our lives, and we were obviously using that to build power collectively where we could. Then there was this other tendency towards kind of isolation, which a lot of people experienced. If you weren't rooted in your community before COVID, you were stuck in your own house. You didn't know anyone. There was not a lot you can do. And what the far right did really successfully was exploit that isolation to, again, spread what has become a kind of foundational mythology for the new right, which was basically like this really successful form of like conspiracism that blends a kind of legitimate critique of this like centralization of political power at the level of the world economy, right? With this very reactionary politics. I have so many thoughts about this because I think it speaks to the kind of like this issue around individualism and concentrated power. If you're like the global elites in the World Economic Forum made up COVID and Bill Gates is giving us, injections with 5G in them or whatever. Like that is, on some level, you're recognizing that the system is unfair and controlled by these extremely powerful elites. But your response to that is to be like, well, they have all the power. There's nothing we can do about it. I just basically have to like critique this system and try and isolate myself from it. And I won't get the vaccine. And I'm going to build like an underground bunker and like hide myself away from the world. Because you're like, yeah, I live in a system in which a small number of powerful people get to control everything, but I can't do anything about it because I'm on my own. And I'm actually really smart because I see all the networks and no one else does, right? So that like far right push towards conspiracism that came out of COVID and became really central. You see it so much now with reform. If you speak to people, they're like, COVID wasn't real. The WEF is trying to force us to do net zero and have 15-minute cities. Something about Bill Gates, like all these kind of weird random things from different parts of the internet. And you're like, how is this a coherent political theology? And it is literally like, they're fucking me over, but I'm on my own and I have to protect myself, basically. And I think that was the other trend that really got strengthened during COVID. And it again, reasserts that need to respond to the acknowledgement, the 18-year-old who stands up and says, yeah, that's all very obvious when I talk about my book. Everyone knows that we live in these incredibly unfair, concentrated, hierarchical systems. But instead of responding to that with, here's what you can do to be a good person in this system, or here's what you can do to protect yourself within this system, instead saying, how can we work together to push back against that system? And you're right that mutual aid organizing was a real alternative. But again, this is why the struggle over working time has always been such a central part of the labour movement. People then went back to their real lives, and there was the cost of living crisis, and they were working 0 hours contracts and had to take on like 3 jobs just to be able to survive. Obviously, those forms of mutual aid evaporate in that context. So it's how we can kind of carve that back out and give people different ways of organising based on their capabilities, without, kind of sacrificing that the centrality of coming together, really.
Grace, thank you very much, and thank you for your books, which have been really inspiring to read. We're in West Belfast, so I think it's appropriate to ask questions about nationalism and its role in politics generally, because here it's been a mechanism for significant resistance, and you're right to point out the way this place works and the organisation that's gone in, and nationalism through republicanism has been a very important part of that. But I think if we're honest and we look across Europe, nationalism is used by the right much more effectively. It's a very powerful tool by the right. It also divides here one's position on it, divides environmental movements, labour movements from Republican movements. All of those versions are probably sitting in here in different ways, despite a common belief in a lot of things. And even in Ireland, we've seen the rise of a right-wing nationalism. So I was wondering, sort of broadly, where you think nationalism sits in a way forward. What are the risks of nationalism, but also potentially the way of using it as a way forward? I'm not sure of the answer, I have to say.
Look, I'm also going to tell you I'm not sure of the answer either. Like, I'm not going to come in here and pretend to give you an answer to that age-old question. What I will say is, I don't think of nationalism as an attachment to the idea of a nation as something that is inherently good or inherently bad. My own view on this, I think, is probably more informed by like the Welsh experience, right? I'm part Welsh, spent a lot of time in North Wales. I think, Raymond Williams writing about what a kind of socialist patriotism looks like, what it looks like to say, I have a sense of attachment to the land and to the people in that land, to the language, to the ecology. That is, it's not just like an important thing or a powerful thing, it's just part of what makes us human. To deny that, to deny the centrality and the importance of place and the ideas that we develop around place that manifest themselves in nation, in community, whatever, I think it would be absurd. The idea that we are all just, that we could detach ourselves from the places that made us is, I think, wrong. But there is also this kind of hollow patriotism, right, that says, I am committed to the institutions of state. You see, this is just like everywhere in British politics. I remember one of my most formative experiences was going on Question Time with Jacob Rees-Mogg, and there was a question about whether or not we should be proud of Churchill or something. And it ignited this like huge debate. And I was like, well, obviously, this isn't something that we should be proud of, given the atrocities that, this man committed. And yeah, of course, there are ways of understanding the nation and one's place within it and the communities that arise within that nation that can and are and will be a source of pride and a source of solidarity. But when that becomes that kind of hollow patriotism, that hollow nationalism that says, again, I'm attached to the institutions of state, institutions which, if you live in a capitalist society, are just, the capitalist class dominates. I'm not going to say that, the state is always just a tool of capital, because I think it's more complicated than that. Working people have won victories within our state institutions. But in capitalist societies, the state will always be dominated by the interests of capital. Not to mention in England, where I'm from, a age-old aristocracy and monarchy that literally doesn't give a shit about the vast majority of people in this country. So if your nationalism is, I love and respect these symbols and values and institutions, then it is, to me, meaningless. Not to mention the fact that that often goes alongside with this idea that we should hate people who aren't from within that nation, right? And that is just dividing people against themselves 101, right? Is create a different other, not the people who are actually oppressing you and screwing you over and exploiting you, but the people who look a bit different from you or speak a bit different from you or whatever. But that sense of pride that comes from being from somewhere and that connects you with the other people and the other beings and the natural world that exists in that place is something that I think we should cherish and that any progressive politics has to build on.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I kind of want to build on a couple of the questions. I have a friend who I love, but he smoked too much weed and watched too much YouTube and he's been radicalised, right? And he's from, I think, there are structures or a cultural narrative within Catholic nationalist Republican communities that are maybe protects them against that radicalisation of the right a wee bit more than maybe here in Northern Ireland, the community's Protestant Unionist Royalist. So it's twofold. How do we build that resistance or that resilience in those communities, in PUL communities? But secondly, how do we speak to people? Because the left is good at lecturing, right? And we're good at presenting facts or academia, but it doesn't hit people in the heart. So how do we get people back who've been radicalised by that bullshit?
I think I've learned this the hard way. I mean, you can literally imagine me as like a posh, Oxford-educated, like 24-year-old enthusiastic Labour voter going to like the Northeast and being like, "Hi, will you vote for the Labour Party?" Like, the kind of conversations that I had were often pretty funny and legitimately so. The thing I've basically learned through like very hard life lessons is that you can't really convince people. You just have to kind of listen to them. So I actually read a really fantastic book not that long ago that I'd really recommend to everyone. It was called Don't Talk About Politics by Sarah Steen Lebrano. And she is a sociologist and a neuroscientist, I think, actually. And she cites all of these studies, wrote this fantastic book, really easy to read, about how if you go into a conversation trying to convince someone of anything that is political, they will just reject it completely out of hand. There was another really interesting study that she cited where it was like, got people in a room and asked them how they thought a light bulb worked, and then presented them with some new information that made them change their mind. And they were like, they all changed their mind. They were like, presented with new information, obviously I'm going to change my mind. Then they got people into a room who had different views about gun ownership and presented them with new information about the realities of gun ownership. And even if it contradicted their previous beliefs, none of them changed their minds. In fact, it consolidated and cemented them in their pre-existing beliefs, even when that information contradicted what they thought before. Because politics isn't about facts or convincing people with arguments. It is, in a lot of ways, about identity. And I don't mean that in a kind of identity politics like sense. I mean like it's about who we think we are. And like the neoliberals knew that. That's why they had this whole mission to convince us that we're all alone and we have to compete with each other rather than working together. And you know, today, like a lot of our political views, because they haven't been formed as part of collectives, because they're not formed in conversation with other people necessarily or in community with other people, they become very specific to our own particular view of how we see ourselves, right? So if you're talking about someone who like smokes a lot of weed and watches a lot of YouTube and they've been radicalized by the far right, they're probably like, you know, I've been screwed over and the elites are out to fuck me over and I can't trust anyone. And this is how I'm going to develop my identity and my response to that problem. And if you come in there and you're like, well, actually, you're wrong because this, and this, they're obviously not going to trust you because they don't trust anyone. It's the same with all these conversations I was mentioning with people on the doorstep who feel hopeless or feel angry or who are in this place of despair. The only way you bring those people, not even bring them around, but kind of bring them along, is by listening and saying, okay, well, what is it that is actually going on in your life? And like, how can we work with you on that? I remember having a really great conversation a while ago with these guys who work with this organization called Acorn, which is kind of like a community union. Like, they do a lot of tenants organizing and stuff. And they were like trying to organize this block of flats who had just had this horrendous, shitty landlord, and trying to bring all these people in this block of flats together to make their rental situation better, basically. And they were like, we had to have long conversations with people who were like hardcore far-right supporters, right? And they didn't go in and say, we think that you should join this tenants union because we're very left-wing and you should be too, and we need to organize as workers to defeat the capitalist class or whatever. They were just like, we want to take on your shitty landlord. There's a lot of evidence that other people in your block of flats are experiencing these same issues. Do you want to join us? And then they did, and they won, because they organized all these people and they achieved a victory. Now, that victory is not going to, on its own, have converted lots of people from the far right to the left, but it is going to have built a sense of community and solidarity that can then take you on that journey away from those more individualistic ideologies and towards something a little bit different. So I think, yeah, that form of consciousness raising does come through organizing and through listening.
I can just ask a question quickly, Grace. Apologies for jumping after, but just on this idea of building power, and central, as you say, central to neoliberalism has been this idea of we're all atomized kind of individuals, selfishly pursuing, moving up the greasy pole or whatever else, but that also is hand in hand with this deep sense of precarity as well. That we're constantly, you can slip off that pole and then end up on the street. So while you play the game, you can have, Netflix and Amazon Prime and 14 different varieties of pepper sauce, but at any minute you can slip off that and you're out the street. And that kind of fuels in people the sense of don't rock the boat, but also this idea of having less and less free time. People are working longer hours, less time to sit about and discuss ideas, and we've seen the impact of that from redistribution, the May redistribution that happened in America post World War II, led to the anti-war movement, the heavy movement in the 60s, which was a threat to power. Because people had more time, they had secure jobs, and there was a rising middle class. So in terms of that building power, how do we build, and have you seen any examples of building economic power outside of the system, where it insulates people from this sense of precarity? Yanis Varoufakis talks about we're leaving capitalism and heading into techno-feudalism. In that scenario, we're going to be the techno-serfs. So how do we build our own lifeboats, in economic power outside of those?
Yeah, great question. I was in the US recently. I was actually in Texas, weirdly, and it really brought home to me the power of creating a permanent underclass in making people feel too scared to want to organize politically. I mean, in the US, it's so potent, right? Because you have just mass incarceration of people who, would otherwise be part of that broad movement against those at the top. You have homelessness on another level, right? These people who are completely disenfranchised. They have fallen out of any part of this social safety net. You have a massive problem with drugs. And this creation of that kind of permanent underclass, which is so vast, and you see literally everywhere. It is normal to just walk throughout the street in any city in the US and see just hundreds of homeless people, all in various different states of distress. And just to normalize that and to be like, yeah, that's what happens if you don't work hard. Like, obviously, they deserve it, right? That's so powerful ideologically to have created that level of acceptance of that system. The other thing I remember seeing was there was a poster in a McDonald's saying help wanted, and under the benefits, it listed healthcare. And obviously, I know that you have to get a job to have good health insurance in the US, but seeing that on a sign was so stark. It was like, benefits of having a job, you get healthcare. Like, obviously, the workers in the US are going to be too terrified to join a union and accept a really low wage if one of the benefits of having a job is you get to live, right? So I think that this is why these questions around electoral politics and kind of what non-reformist reforms is the kind of nerdy way of thinking about this. There's this guy, Andre Gortz, who has this idea of how reforms that you can get within the state, whilst not necessarily radical in themselves, can help to build power in such a way that allows people to win bigger victories. This, you saw this with social democracy, right? When you have the NHS social security, good public services, social housing. The problem with that model within capitalism was that it created a very confident working class, right? Because if you were fired, you wouldn't die, right? You would have not just the solidarity from your community, which was very, very important, but you would have this infrastructure that would protect you if you were to lose your job. That was obviously a very coherent part of the neoliberal project, was getting rid of all that so that you would be scared to organise, so that you would be scared to demand better pay and conditions. And which is why I do think, there is still a really important role for electoral politics and for winning those victories, because they can create a platform to win more victories. Having said that, there is so much that can be done now even without that. And it does require I guess thinking about organising in terms of our different capabilities, because there are going to be people who have 4 jobs who you want as part of your coalition, but who don't have time to organise. And you can't just say to them, oh, well, you're only supporting us on social media, so you're not a real activist. Let them support you on social media, right? And then those people who are retired or who are students or who don't have to work as much as everyone else, or who are able to be employed by the institution themselves, can then take on more of that burden and reach out to those people who you would want as part of your coalition. And in terms of the economic side of this, how do we protect ourselves in the context of a state that is retreating and corporations that are becoming increasingly rapacious? One thing that I have loved to see grow recently is the cooperative movement. So I wrote a case study in Vulture Capitalism about a farming cooperative in Argentina. And they kind of started a series of cooperatives, basically because there were these big developers that came into their town and said, we're going to build all these expensive housing developments and basically going to price you all out of it. And they basically organized a campaign to say no to the housing development. And they were like, right, okay, what are we going to do with this campaign now? And they built a cooperative, a dairy cooperative initially, which local people were all members of. It engaged the local farming community, and it provided everyone in the local community with cheaper access to milk. They then expanded that into a cooperative that was making bread and various other foodstuffs, and built up all of these different cooperatives that allowed them to kind of provide for people's basic needs, housing cooperatives as well, outside of the state and of kind of broadly speaking capitalism. You obviously had Gael-Ionad here last year. His model is another really good example of that. So I think, that model of cooperativism and of kind of I think there's probably in some parts of the left maybe a bit of a a bit of kind of looking down on community organising that is forming businesses, right? For example, community interest companies or local businesses that support local people, because they're okay, well, it's a business, it's not a political party or a union or whatever. But again, really important, because those businesses, again, the place I was telling you about earlier that I was in North Wales, they have a series of locally owned energy companies that create hydroelectric power from the water that comes out of the mountains. Really important, because it gives people access to cheap energy, right? So I think, even those institutions that you might create that would still technically be within the market but can provide your community and your place with protection when things go wrong are really important.
Just wanted to come in, I suppose, up in the back of something that Chris and the Mal and the Dominic asked there, and just to get your opinion on this idea of participatory democracy versus representative democracy, because in a sense we've come full circle here. But we'll have our Dominics here from the Green Party. But all the other local political parties were invited here and they didn't come because they didn't have them to learn, because they're really smart and clever and they're active politics. We reject that, and we aren't. And this isn't a nationalist project, and we don't believe in nationalism. We're Republicans and we're socialists.
Yeah.
We're building socialism from below. And in a sense, this community here has run full circle from in the 60s and the 70s. As Nell was saying earlier on, people spoil their vote. Built community cooperatives here in the area.
Yeah.
What happened here over the process of the peace process is people were essentially co-opted into the state, and what the peace process did was demobilise, depoliticize, and de-radicalise the community here. So what we're doing is about building from below, and we are clearly aware of the limits of electoral politics. When we had our Toronto Majority campaign, we took great joy in putting the political parties at the back. So the young people went at the front,
Yeah.
including the political parties that they were at the back, because they were at the service of the community. They were at the service
Yeah.
of the movement. We weren't dependent on them. We were moving and thinking beyond them. So I'm wondering what examples that you have of that practical participatory democracy model in the different organisations that you've met across the world.
That's a great question. And I think, the models that I have of participatory democracy are going to be, I guess, limited in this context because they do start from change that is introduced from like a local government level, right? So I think, I would have to have much more of a think about how you would do that kind of participatory democracy outside of the realms of the local state. But the obvious examples are the participatory budgeting movement, right? So Porto Alegre is obviously where this all started, and initially was really successful before basically being co-opted into a standard business consults with civil society via local government type process. But there's loads of other examples of how the participatory budgeting process has been put in place in other local areas and remained really rooted in community. One of the really interesting ones I looked at was in Iceland, in Reykjavik, where after the financial crisis, obviously, there was a huge backlash against just both the dominance of finance over society and the way in which those financial institutions had really kind of captured the state. And they pushed in Reykjavik for this Better Neighbourhoods program, which is essentially a kind of participatory budgeting program pushed from the ground up via a new political movement that ended up doing really well in the elections that followed the financial crisis, and remained really engaged in the community. And because it was based around this political movement that was, I guess, kind of already pretty conscious and self-aware, prioritized things like, they, had this massive campaign to kind of end homelessness in the local area, to fund much more education, and to really, co-opt those local state institutions in favor of the community. Now, I think the whole participatory budgeting movement thing is an interesting case because if you don't have pre-existing, strong, organized, collective power within the community, you will just get this civil society engagement type approach, right? Which is basically where you get a bunch of businesses together with some local politicians and then representatives of NGOs, and you get them to sit around the table, and the business says, we want to do this, and then everyone else basically has to kind of get on board or they don't get any money. I think that's, the model that we have in a lot of the kind of devolution agenda, actually, particularly across the UK. But it's also, if you have those pre-existing forms of kind of social solidarity, you are able to resist that kind of corporatization of that process. It kind of, again, reminds me of so the theory that I use in the book to describe how state power works is this kind of older Marxist theory of the state as a social relation. It's basically saying it's not a tool that is just owned by the ruling class, nor is it a neutral thing that you can kind of go into and change just by having a different government. Instead, it's a social relation like capital. So what happens within the state depends on the balance of power within society. If you're able to build powerful political movements outside the state and then mobilize within that, you get things like the weekend and the NHS and good public services. Those things don't stem naturally from electing a nice government that says it wants to do nice policies. They emerge from shifting the balance of power within society as a whole. And I think the same thing is true at the local level, right? If you're able to build those powerful political institutions that exist outside of the state, it's much easier to then kind of co-opt local institutions to get what you want out of a local budget, or just out of kind of even out of business communities, right? If you have that level of power at a local level, you can push for so much and win so much more easily. I think that's kind of what you guys are doing really successfully here already. You're building both power and also resilience by creating physical places and spaces, by backing that up with funding, by building this network out in your community that will allow you to wield real power. And then the question will be, okay, well, how do we want to use that power?
I'm conscious that Grace has been speaking for well over an hour now, and we're really her back on everything. We'll probably take a couple of last questions here together. Yourself and yourself, sir, just take you together.
Thank you very much. My name is Siobhan. I work for a the whole of Ireland. And unfortunately, what we've seen quite a lot of over the last year, and unfortunately within our own community in West Belfast, we have seen kind of community turn on people who really are at the fringes of society, where they are very much othered because they're not exactly the same as they maybe have a kind of complex life experience. So I wonder, we do a lot of work to kind of build the capacity of people within our homeless support services to participate and take part in community. How do we build the capacity of our communities to resist that individualistic temptation to kind of fall to far-right messaging and fall to the far-right rhetoric? Because we've actually had a brilliant legacy in West Belfast of fighting that. It was really, really sad to see that recently, but I'm seeing it so much more, particularly towards migrant communities in particular.
Yeah. Sorry, you want to take?
No.
Okay. Sorry, I'll try and answer quickly, even though it's a huge question. I spoke to a really amazing woman from the south of the US, I can't remember where, who created an organization called Southern Solidarity. And she basically, it was during COVID, saw all these people becoming homeless and saw the kind of pathetic response of kind of the NGO community, basically. And so decided, right, we're going to build an organization for homeless people by homeless people. And it's based on this, she came out of the civil rights movement, right? It's like nothing about us without us. It was really about putting the people who were experiencing these issues at the heart of the provision of those services. And she was like, it was really hard at first because like we would go out and talk to these people and they would like spit on us and like shout at us and swear at us and whatever. But like very slowly, after like bringing them food every day, we eventually managed to build up this level of trust. And now these are the people who run the organization, and they do really cool things in the community. Like they host political education events that bring people from all over the world to come and speak. And I thought that was just like such a cool and interesting example. It sounds like your approach is really similar of instead of being like, how can we solve the problem of homelessness as people working in our charity sector? It's like, how can we use the power that we have to support these people to help themselves? And in terms of like how you would kind of fight back against this othering, it's like on a macro level, we can talk about like building power and bringing people into movements, and that's really important. But I think on that individual level, when you're talking to people, and I've experienced this doing interviews for my book, when you're talking to people who really fall for that like othering, whether it's of migrants, whether it's of homeless people, it's like, they just didn't work hard enough, or they're like these foreign other kind of less than human person, really. That doesn't come from nowhere. That's like something that's been internalized and then smushed around and then projected back onto someone else, right? The people who are most sucked in by like, you see this like the manosphere stuff, right? Like hustle culture, who like love Andrew Tate, right? They're people who like often struggled through school, came out the other side, didn't get a job, maybe like were bullied, feel like I'm a low status person in this society where status is mediated by money and power and like all of this other stuff. And they feel like they have been shat on, so they go and shit on other people, right? So at like that individual level of speaking to people, you're really trying to like rebuild people's self-esteem, which is really hard. But I think also why like community organizing is so important, because we need to be able to give people a sense of, and I think this particularly does actually apply to young men, perhaps even more than young women, giving people a sense of status that comes from your role within a community and the things that you're doing for and with other people, which is historically where status would come from, rather than like how much money you have or how many cars you have or how many women you have or whatever else. That's a really important long-term project. And yeah, I think it starts at the community level.
Chris, and the last question, sorry.
The next question was quite similar to this.
Sarah, over Backdoor Bailouts.
Mine is not on. Thank you. I work as an organiser with New Script for Mental Health. It's a grassroots mental health movement here in the north. But so many bells, so many everything that was being said and discussed here, we're ringing it around. connecting all of this to mental health, because one of the things we see is that actually mental health is probably at the sharpest end of the whole impact of neoliberalism and capitalism. Because what we've seen happening is that everything has been individualised and internalised and atomised, like you were saying, Kieran. But mental health is now, there's such a dominant narrative around it, trying to break through that. So it's either a broken brain, but it's disconnected from the conditions of people's lives and the context of people's lives that we've been talking about here, around housing and precarity and all of the social and economic things that are driving huge levels of distress across the world that we've never seen before. But yet the dominant narrative is still quite strong that this is an individual problem, it's something faulty in you, and the only thing you'll be offered from our health services, certainly in the western part of the world, is individualised CBT. Fix yourself. If you're lucky, we might give you a few sessions of help, but actually there's something you need to fix yourself, and it's handed back to the individual. So what New Script is trying to do, I suppose, at a simple, is join up those dots, because we know that you can only heal in relation with other people. Healing only happens in community and with other people. You cannot heal on your own. And we also know that the power of community and solidarity, and that's what we see here. All the time with a strong community. That's where the power is. But all the other thing people need, and what you were talking, Grace, is people need to be able to make meaning of their suffering. We all do, because we're all in our lives suffering in different ways. But the meaning we're being handed down is that bit about it's individual, it's something, and it's disconnected from economics and politics. So I'm just wondering, what have you seen, or how do you see, because like you said, Siobhan, it's still othered, but mental health is very much othered still within the left and within organising. It's still something people are nervous of talking about it, and that's how psychiatry has dominated. People don't really want to touch it, So can you see, in terms of integrating it into the broader project, how this is also about power? Because the activists for a long time thought it was about an information deficit. If they could go and tell their stories to power, then we would get them to understand the harm and the result and how things can be different. And the hard learning over 20 years was it's not an information deficit, it's a power deficit. Yeah. So we've kind of flipped everything we're doing. So sorry for that long.
No, I think that was. I would very happily listen to you speak. So.
Have you seen with the work you're doing how mental health and how we can connect and through the silencing?
What you were just talking about then, it reminded me of, I interviewed someone for this book that I'm writing, because I'm kind of looking into this very issue, who was actually a pastor in the US, and did a lot of work, what he kind of called pastoral care. It was basically like, therapy, effectively, for people who would come in and have all sorts of life issues. And he was like, I've been doing that for 30 years. And he wrote this book called Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age. And his argument was basically like, I haven't seen the kind of nature of the kind of suffering that people have experienced change that much. It has changed a lot. There's always been poverty, there's always been deprivation. That's gotten worse, sure. But what I have seen change even more than that is the way that people are making sense of this. And people will come in and they will sit down and they will say, I have lost my job. Why am I so worthless and pathetic? Like, what is wrong with me, right? Whereas historically, it would have been so much easier to connect that with an understanding of, okay, your boss fired you, and he's part of this massive company that just paid out all this money to shareholders. You would have had access to those narratives and people who would have explained that to you in your community, in your workplace, in politics, just throughout society. But today it's like, oh no, I lost my job, I'm useless, I'm worthless, like, what's wrong with me? And of course, that's going to create all sorts of mental health problems and challenges. And then alongside that lack of self-esteem that comes from interpreting your exploitation under capitalism as an individual failure, it makes you less likely to seek out other people because you have that blocker of shame. And obviously, there's all sorts of in religious and Christian communities, like, that whole issue of shame probably runs even deeper, right? Like, there's something wrong with me. I have to go away and purify myself and make myself whole before I can come into contact with other people and actually talk about what's going on. So you're absolutely right to say that. And I think even the other thing that it reminded me of was the work that has been done supporting people who obviously experience mental ill health and trauma in conflict zones, right? Because in those contexts, there are two things that you realize. Firstly, is that thing that you said, which is like, you cannot heal on your own. The whole community has to heal together because we've all been through this together, so we have to heal together. Secondly, there aren't enough resources to provide us all with individual mental health therapy. So instead, we have to come together and we have to do group therapy, or we have to figure out ways of supporting each other. And it's almost like, you need community to be able to provide those layers of support. For someone experiencing trauma, they need not just one person, they need a group of people to be able to support them, talk to them. Those people who are doing the supporting need other people around them who are going to be able to support them, right? And that's the kind of resilience that you only find in community. And you're right, it's the only way. I'm not saying that, it's going to cure depression and all of these other serious mental health issues. Of course not. People are always going to have those issues. But the question is the society that we live in making that worse? Yes, definitely. And is the society that we live in preventing us from coming together to support people who are going through that stuff? Yes, absolutely. So what you're doing, it sounds like, is really very radical by supporting people to recognize that your mental ill health is not an individual personal failing. The causes of those issues, the traumatic events you've been through in your life, do not result from an individual personal failing. And you're not going to get through this on your own just by going to a therapist every week or, taking these drugs or whatever. You need to heal with other people. And I think that it's a nail in the heart of neoliberalism.
From where?